Hey everyone, welcome to episode 3.
Hey guys, welcome back.
Today we're going to be discussing a really big topic, boundaries. We know this is a big topic, so we decided to break boundaries into smaller, bite-sized episodes.
Yeah, so just kind of a little overview. We're going to be talking about boundaries in general, why they're so important, kind of what they are, and then our individual journeys with boundaries. And then we'll kind of give you some tips on how to start setting them up in your life based on our experiences. So, Lauren, what do we mean when we say boundaries?
Yeah, so what do we mean? Textbook definition: boundaries are limits we place on relationships about behavior we will and will not accept. They can be both emotional or physical. Emotional boundaries are items such as how you allow someone to talk to you or how much energy you're willing to put into a relationship. And then physical boundaries are how close we allow somebody or something to get to us.
Yeah, and why is it important to remember that? Boundaries have been huge in my life, and it really is an important marker for respect for myself and in general for people respecting themselves. If you love yourself, you got to set up those boundaries so that you can stay balanced and healthy. And I know that sounds a little bit silly, like how can setting up boundaries maintain that respect for myself, and how can that change my relationship with myself personally? But it really does. It shows yourself that you're putting yourself first, and it allows you to make sure that you're not allowing things to make you upset emotionally, and that you're physically safe and balanced. And so that's how we start to flourish as individuals, when we really set those things up for ourselves and put ourselves first. So with that being said, Lauren, what was your first experience with boundaries, and like when did they become important to you? When did you realize that they were important?
This is a really big topic. Okay, so my story with boundaries, I feel at least, is pretty unique. I have personally never met somebody who has experienced my same exact experience that I have gone through when it has come to boundaries. So if you're out there after hearing my story, please feel free to let me know. I would love for you to reach out and us to talk about it, because like I said, never met anybody, and that would be cool to meet somebody who has had that similar experience. With all that said, here is kind of what I have gone through as far as boundaries are. When I was a child, I unfortunately had a parent that could not take care of me in a proper manner. And coming from divorced parents, this became a really tricky situation, as one could imagine, not only because I was left alone with them for long periods of time, but also because there was not much I could do. I started speaking up for myself and telling other adults in my life what was happening when I had the chance and was able to realize the situation at hand. But unfortunately, I came to learn that there was not much that could be done. It was basically fight or flight for me. And after realizing my words weren't getting me much of anywhere, I started to try and physically remove myself from the situation. I was around 8 years old when I finally went from telling adults that I was uncomfortable to attempting at physically removing myself from the situation. And unfortunately, even after trying to go to court, which most people would think, like getting the legal system involved would solve my problems or solve somebody's problems, there was literally nothing that could be done. And I just want you to know that this experience as a whole is truly one of the most life-shaping things that I have ever gone through in my entire life. Even just talking about it right now is pretty deep, and it's definitely hard to talk about.
Yeah, so you really got like the early introduction to boundaries.
Yeah. Like I said, I was like around 8 years old. So, there became points after I realized I would not be able to get out of that situation that, like, I took some pretty drastic measures to try and set boundaries for myself because, like I said, nobody was listening to me. And the largest one, and I think the most shocking one for me, even looking back now, was that physically, to try and remove myself, I would try and jump out of the car as my parent at the time would be driving me because I was too young to drive.
Did you actually do that, or was it just a plan you came up with? You did?
No, I actually.
Oh my God.
I did it.
Did you get hurt?
No, but
That's
I did
good.
jump out of the car while we were driving down the road.
Oh my goodness.
So, yeah, it's definitely not something that's light. Like, just thinking about a child, like, just sit there and think about it. A child physically not knowing how to get out of a situation and wanting it so desperately that the only way they feel that they can get out of it is by causing physical harm to themselves.
Yeah.
Like, children do not just do that. People in general do not just do that. But I had no other physical way out, so I started, like, physically harming myself to try and get out of the situation.
And that's important to bring up with boundaries because, like, boundaries are really hard to set even when you are setting them in sort of a normal, and that's, like, a terrible word, so I'm putting air bunnies even though you can't see me. But even when you're setting up, like, more like boundaries that are kind of regular that other people set up for themselves, they're already hard. So having to set boundaries like that's crazy, and hopefully it makes it a little easier to set up smaller boundaries now.
Yeah, and I do want to, let our audience know that I did report everything that happened, including the physical things, and even then I was forced by court order to stay with that parent. It wasn't until my sibling actually was hospitalized at one point that it was finally deemed okay for me not to see that parent anymore and not to have any more physical parenting time with that parent. And then 5 years after that, right before I was about to turn 18, CPS was called over something that had happened to my sibling. And at that point, they started to do a investigation of that parent and what had been brought to light. And at that point, I was 4 months away from turning 18. And once you turn 18 within the family court system, you are deemed as an adult, and you can, like, make choices for yourself. So you're no longer under their ruling or their saying of what you have to do. So at that point, I was, like, literally 4 months away from already being there. And when CPS got involved, they came into the situation and they were basically just like, what you went through should have never happened, and we're really sorry that you went through all this.
I mean, that's kind of a whole nother episode. Like,
it totally is, but it was just like, it felt like a slap to the face almost, because, I had gone at that point about 10 years, almost exactly, of dealing with all this. And then at the very end, like, just as I was about to finally get out, to have these people come in and say, what I went through was not okay. It was just, like, a mind-blowing experience for me. So anyways, back to the main point of boundaries here. That was kind of my, like, introduction to boundaries, which was crazy fast, like, not many people, I feel, have that kind of experience with it. But it is something that I have personally kind of just learned to accept for what it is, learn from it, and do my best to make sure that I don't repeat that going forward. So, like, let's say I have kids, I don't want to put them in that situation. So that's definitely been a learning point for me. And most of my feelings now, as an adult who has been able to fully process what happened, I'm just really saddened by the family court system, because even after going through all that I did, I have continued to watch time and time again kids' lives getting wrecked by the system. And ever since going through that at a young age, boundaries have been very important to me, especially the normalization of not having to have people in your life, even if they're family, because of toxicity. So,
Right. So
yeah,
it kind of sounds like boundaries became important to you because they had to be important. Like you were unsafe.
100%. Exactly. Yeah. And that was like the immediate feeling I got of just feeling unsafe. But at that time in my life, I didn't have the words to say, like, this person is crossing my boundaries.
And I think that's incredible though that you were able to set that you knew you needed to set them. Like you weren't actually able to because people weren't listening to you. But the fact
Right.
that as an 8-year-old you were able to realize, all right, I need to set these boundaries for myself is kind of incredible. Because that's not my experience with boundaries at all.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. What about you? When did they become important for you?
They became important to me like all at once, sort of, but also very slowly, which is like this very like opposites. But it was a really slow process that I didn't know was happening, I guess. I never had boundaries. Like I was not in I don't know if I was in a situation where I felt like I needed them when I was younger, or if I just had no one in my life that set boundaries, so I didn't have any role models to look at to set boundaries. I'm not really sure why it never occurred to me to set them, but I literally had none. My whole life have been the kind of person that will stay up until 4 a.m. with someone who needs me as a friend, and I would stay up all night and do my homework even if I couldn't. And thankfully, I had a mom who would let me stay home from school the next day. So she kind of was like, I guess, helping me set up those boundaries that I didn't know I need, which like sleep is a huge one. But I didn't know that was what was happening when I was staying home from school. It was like, all right, this is your boundary. You can't function anymore. You have to sleep. But I didn't know that's what it was. I should have set that boundary way earlier instead of staying up until 4, 5 in the morning doing homework. And like boundaries with my friends, I didn't have them. I don't really even have boundaries like when I have conversations with people. There's really no topic that's off limits. Which I don't know if that's a bad thing, but
no. And I think everything that you're saying, I personally, now this again, personal opinion here, I personally feel like your story is a little bit more status quo for what happens like out there with other people. Like I said, I think my introduction to boundaries was a little bit different than what a lot of people go through. But I don't think that any of your boundaries or your realization of it happened too late in life. I don't think that your story and how it happened for you is a bad thing at all. Like, I think it happens the way that it happens for everybody. And what you just said, too, I wanted to comment on. You said I'd stay up, till 4 a.m. talking to a friend if they would need it. I still do that to this day. So, like, just because we look at boundaries, everybody has boundaries in different ways, and I think that's really important, normalizing that everybody's boundaries look different.
Yeah, so I still do that too, but I don't do it every time. Like, I now can recognize when I can't do that, and there were times when I would do it when I absolutely couldn't. Like, I had a test the next day or a presentation the next day, and it was like a detriment to my own health to be doing that for someone else, and I would still do it. Now, if it's going to be a detriment to my own health, I'm not going to do it. But most of the time it's not a detriment to my own health, so I will. But if it's a situation where it will actually cause harm to my day the next day to do that, I no longer will do it, whereas I used to. And so that's a boundary that's like new for me. So
that's fair.
Why they're important to me is because not because I was unsafe. I'm glad that it wasn't that dangerous for me, like why they became important to me. But they became important to me because, as I said, they kind of happened accidentally. I started slowly setting them unconsciously, and then like as I started going to therapy, I started setting them unconsciously through like other things I was working on. And then I started doing the same thing when I started my new job at Image Tours. I started just piling things on top of myself and not having any time in the day for me. I had no personal boundaries with anything for my own health. And so I had lost that little bit of boundaries I started to set up, and then I was a mess. I was like it's ironic that we talked about burnout last episode, but I've kind of been burnt out my whole friggin' life because I haven't set boundaries for myself. And I started to get burnt out again, and I realized I was just this big old ball of mess because I wasn't adhering to boundaries that I kind of started to realize that I need. So that's the why. That's my why. And the when are kind of both at the same time. It's because I accidentally set them up and then lost them and then realized that I can't function this way. So
yeah, I mean, that's fair. And also, I think another thing that's fair to address with what you just stated, I think boundaries are a rolling thing. I don't think they're stagnant in a fact that, you know, they're never going to change. I think as we grow older, our boundaries go through evolution.
mm-hmm.
And, you know, like we change them based on or according to what we're currently going through in life. And what I'm hearing you say is, you know, like when you started your job, like you kind of had to reevaluate and start from scratch, I guess. Not really from scratch, but you kind of had to start over and reevaluate from where you were and reestablish.
Well, it wasn't quite that, because even before I started my job, boundaries still wasn't a word in my vocabulary.
Oh, gotcha.
So my how I started setting them was very unconscious. And so the first thing I worked on in therapy was relationships with other people, because I would get very frustrated when I would do things for other people that they wouldn't do in return for me. And so like kind of a basic example of that is the staying up till 4 a.m. thing. Like I would give my heart and soul to my friends and people in my life and then wouldn't get that same thing back. And it made me very angry, and it made me actually like just want to cut off relationships with people. And it was because I was doing things that weren't healthy for myself, and then I was expecting other people to do those things back for me, and other people weren't doing them because it wasn't healthy for them to do.
Right.
And so I started saying no to people, and that's how I was able to start setting boundaries, but I didn't know that's what they were. It was completely like, all right, this is how I'm going to mend my relationships with people and not just get angry at them when they don't do things for me. And so I started saying no, and I started putting myself first, kind of like we said right at the beginning, that the reason setting boundaries is so important is because it puts you first. So I started putting me first, not knowing it was boundaries. And then when I started my job, I went right back into my old habits. I had less time. And so I started just like piling things on top of each other. In any crevice of time I had in my day, I would pile things into it. And again, was not putting myself first. So that's when I realized, like, actually when we started doing this podcast is when I realized that I had been setting boundaries for myself. Then I started the job, lost those boundaries, and then realized I can't handle life without these things. So does that kind of make sense? I didn't realize they were boundaries until we started doing the prep for this episode, and like it forced me to start thinking about, okay, when did I actually start setting boundaries, and when did I realize they're boundaries? I realized that they were boundaries today, like last week when we started setting up boundaries.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that, our episode could assist you in kind of that thought process and get you thinking about it some more. It sounds like it was really helpful for you.
Yeah, so that was a whole big spiel about like how I started setting them up like consciously. So when did you consciously get aware of what boundaries were and setting them up? Because like as at 8 years old, you don't know that it's a boundary, like you said.
Right. Yeah. So setting up boundaries was never really a conscious thought for me per se. Going back to my first experience with boundaries, I was never taught at 8 years old, this is what boundaries are and etc. So it was never really conscious. It was more so of a feeling that I got that I knew something was wrong, like I said earlier. And as a child, I didn't have the words to express exactly what I was feeling or needing, which I think was a huge problem with, or not problem, but I think was a huge reason for why things got handled the way that they did. But anyways, I knew it wasn't okay. And now as an adult, I'm able to identify the fact that what I was feeling back then was the need for boundaries. And by obtaining that knowledge, or like how I obtained it, was through years of therapy where I had to be educated on what I went through as a child and learn what my feelings are after already having had taken the action as a child, which is like reverse. Like normally you learn what boundaries are and then you do them, or at least I feel like that's
Do you
like,
though? I don't know because
I don't know, like I feel like that's kind of like
we're similar
the
on
problem.
that. Like we both set boundaries without really knowing what boundaries were, and then learned
Right.
later what
Maybe
they were.
maybe it's a more common thing, and like I just think that my experience was very abnormal, so I just kind of thought that you like learn about it and then you put it into place. But anyways, I became conscious of what boundaries were, or like consciously setting up boundaries once I actually learned what they were, and that was through going to therapy and learning kind of what I went through as a child. And yeah, I mean, there's not really much more to that there.
I think that I think that they should set up a class in high school or something for balance and mental health and boundaries because I
Oh,
mean,
for
if I
sure.
had known freshman year of high school what a boundary was, I would have been so much less anxious and like happier in the brain than I was. And it makes me really sad that
Right.
it took me until the prep for this episode to realize what I like that they were setting up that I was setting up boundaries.
Yeah, I will say in my experience that I was very fortunate, and that my other parent, that was not the unhealthy one, did put me into therapy around, I want to say, 8 or 9 years old, somewhere around there. So I did have the ability to kind of start talking through what I was going through. And it did eventually bring up the conversation of what boundaries are. So I feel like I understood that at a younger age. But that didn't happen until I was probably like, gosh, I must have been at least 10 or 11 before kind of like the whole big picture played out, and my therapist was able to kind of step back and see what was going on. Um, and at that point, I did know. So maybe I was a little bit younger in learning what boundaries were. But at that time, like, I still was, under the discretion of people who were older than me. I was only like I said, 11, probably 10, I don't know, somewhere around there. And adults were still controlling my life. So it's like if I said I wanted a boundary, it wasn't always necessarily respected.
Yeah.
Cuz like the adults felt like they knew what was best for me, like I'm your parent, I'm your guardian, I know what's best for you, yada yada yada. But I don't know how to say that any differently. Like I knew what the boundary was, but even if I did express it, it sometimes wouldn't be taken seriously, which in and of itself was frustrating.
Do you feel like
Anyways,
it's that you found it easier to start setting up boundaries for yourself now that you have a word for it?
yes and no. I I was gonna touch on this a little bit later in the episode, but I think that going through what I did made it easier for me to set up boundaries because I was literally going against what was the social norm. And people didn't like that.
Mm-hmm.
Especially like in my family, people did not like that. They didn't understand. I don't know what the deal was, but you know, it's the social norm to have a relationship with both of your parents if they're in your life. And I mean, at least 10, 15 years ago it was when I was going through all this. So going against such a large being and saying, no, this is not okay, and them demanding that it was okay and that I needed to like do whatever they said, that kind of made it easy for me to set up boundaries because I already went up against the biggest and the baddest and the toughest force in my life at such a young age when that was what I had. That now setting up boundaries, I'm like, you don't scare me. Like, you know,
I'm glad.
Like, I already went through that when I was little. So, no, not really. And like learning the word boundaries, sure, like it does help in my communication. Like, I can verbally say, you're crossing my boundary here. Whereas before, when I was younger, I didn't really have the means or education to do that. But as far as like my confidence goes in setting up boundaries, no, it doesn't really like do anything.
I feel like that's a whole other conversation too that I didn't even think of before. Is like communicating those boundaries to other people.
Right.
I feel like maybe that's like a whole other episode.
We'll touch on this in another episode. Yeah, you asked me what other episodes we could have on boundaries. That's another one that we could definitely have. Like, boundaries is a huge, huge topic. So I do want to say, with everything I have said thus far, I would never wish my experience upon anyone with how I set up boundaries initially in my life. But with the purpose of this episode and this question, I'm going to give a brief explanation of how I went through setting up boundaries, keeping in mind that I was a child and did not have much of any authority over what happened to me. And I'm doing this for the sole purpose of education and hope that by hearing my story, others are able to notice warning signs if they ever encounter a situation that is similar to mine. So, number 1. I expressed my concerns to other adults who I felt had the ability to help me. And this one is key because even though I didn't have necessarily the exact wording of my boundaries are being pushed by my parent, you know, even though I didn't have those words, I did use other words and I did express what was happening, and what I was expressing weren't small things. Mm-hmm. Like, there was physical stuff that was happening. Like, there was, you know, verbal stuff that was happening. Like, there were a lot of major warning signs within my vocabulary that now looking back on, I feel like should have been picked up on. And I just hope that anybody listening to this right now, if you ever hear a child, you know, saying things along these lines, it should definitely be looked into, because I wish somebody would have picked up on that for me and looked into it further, even though I wasn't using the exact words that I'm able to use today. Number 2, when that didn't work, I started trying to escape as much as possible. I would try and not go with that said parent. I would make up reasons to be away from them. I would arrange for activities when I was supposed to spend time with them, and basically do anything to get myself away from them. And I can remember when I was younger, I had a friend who also had divorced parents, and their parents' schedule just so happened to correlate with my time that was with that parent. So I would always try and go over to that friend's house when I was supposed to be with that parent.
That's very smart.
And unfortunately, they actually passed away about a year and a half ago, and it was like very emotional for me.
Oh no, I'm so sorry.
Because I have spent so much time with them growing up, and you know, they were a really big role model in life. I don't even know if they know that, but like they were a huge role model in my life. Anyways, number 3, eventually that didn't work all the time. And my plan was kind of figured out. So when I wasn't able to escape, I would start in on the physical aspect of it, and which would be like causing harm to myself, which would ultimately force others to help me, and also asking others for help that were outside of the people that I trusted who could bring me help, because it was evident at that point that those people were no longer going to bring me help. And the biggest one that I can think of is I ended up knocking on a neighbor's door when I was like, gosh, I probably was around 10 years old. And they answered the door, and I can just remember me telling them, like, I don't feel safe. Can you please help me? And they looked at me like I had 3 heads. And I can just remember the look on their face, and I was kind of just like standing there like, what has my life come to?
Did they help
Where
you?
nobody's helping me. No. My other parent ended up coming and grabbing me, giving me a reprimand of everything that I just should have not done, put me in the car with the parent that I did not feel comfortable with, and they drove off with me. So
That makes me really mad.
It didn't work at all.
Like, that makes me really,
It did
really
not
mad
work.
to hear.
I would starve myself. That's another big one. I would not eat.
Kind of to get attention.
Yeah. I just wanted out,
Yeah.
and I knew if I didn't eat, I would eventually have to eat, and so they would have to take me somewhere that I would eat. So, like, I was taking drastic measures by, like, 2-3 years in to this whole situation. So
I guess, like,
yeah.
The moral of that story is don't give up. Because if you're even like on a less drastic scale, if people are not respecting your boundaries, you got to keep at it until something works.
No, 100%. Yeah, and like mainly that is my main point, along with the fact that I just want to educate the audience, and I just want them to see or hear firsthand how someone survived that and went through that, and what the warning signs look like, so they can help somebody else out if they are in the position to do that.
Mm-hmm. I think that that's really valuable information, and I have a whole new like admiration for you, and like having to go through that and being the person you are today. Like, that's just really incredible, and I'm sorry that you had to deal with that, but you're a really awesome human being. So
well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, like, I don't take pity on myself for it at all. Like, it's just something that I kind of grew up with and learned to live with, and it is what it is. Sophia, you said that you're kind of a mess without boundaries earlier. I wanted to know, what boundaries have you set up for yourself so you can stay balanced?
Yeah, so I guess we're transitioning from really heavy to a little bit less heavy with that, but
yeah.
I think like we kind of talked a little bit about some of the things in the burnout episode from our last episode, but some of the biggest things are like me time. I have like actual scheduled block time into my week for me, and that that is a boundary. Like, I can't give that up because I will be a mess without it. And if like people are like, well, why can't you hang out with me during that time, or why can't you do XYZ during that time, it's no, I have to put myself first, and I know I need this amount of time to make sure that I stay sane. And that is my boundary. And I used to let people cross it, and now I do not. I am very, very firm about that. And Lauren, you can kind of attest to that a little bit with the whole frequency, even with this podcast. Like, that's my boundary, is I can do what I can do as long as I get my me time in there, and that's just so hugely important to me. Another thing is sleeping. And it's really habitual because, like I said, I've been doing my whole life where I don't really realize how important sleep is. And so if there's something that needs, like, somebody wants to do something with me, or like a task needs to get done, I will take sleep and be like, nope, put it on the shelf. That's not important. But it is. It's hugely important. And so I have to go to sleep I have to get at least 8 hours of sleep. And that's another boundary that I have to set within myself. I have to not put sleep on a shelf. It has to come first. And then a couple of other things are with eating. I have to make sure that I eat. That's not another internal boundary, because sometimes I'll be like, if I don't eat, then I'll feel good about that. And that's another, we'll talk about that more in depth later, on another episode. But I have to make sure that I eat regularly and keep my body fed and nourished. And weighing myself is another one too. I used to weigh myself every day, sometimes 3 or 4 times a day. After, I'd get up in the morning, weigh myself, and then I would weigh myself after every time I ate to see what changed. And so that's a very new boundary that I'm setting for myself, because I realized how unhappy I feel when I do that, because it just makes me constantly be thinking about my weight. And so I've recently started looking at the scale and being like, no, Sophia, not happening. You're not getting on that. And that's a really great boundary that's been making me feel good lately to not do that. And saying no to people. Lauren, I know you can relate to this one with FOMO. I've always had a really hard time saying no to people because of the fear of missing out, FOMO. But I don't need to do every single thing that gets done in the world. I will be okay, and that me time and that alone time is important. So saying no has been huge for me, and trying not to worry about missing out.
Oh, I 100% have it.
But I don't know, does it affect your boundaries at all? Because for me, that FOMO affects my boundaries, because I'm I would rather not miss out than adhere to this boundary.
I guess, yeah, maybe a little bit, but I think a difference between you and I with our boundaries is I've gotten really good at adjusting my schedule, because I'm going to talk about this again actually a little bit down further into the episode, but for me, I used to have anxiety in the form of, I would have my set schedule every single day, 8 a.m. until I went to bed, or whenever I woke up to when I went to bed. And if I didn't do everything according to plan in whatever order, I would have anxiety. And so for me, I've learned how can I, adjust my schedule throughout the day and it be okay. And that has alleviated a lot of anxiety for me. So for me, while I do still struggle with fear of missing out, I've learned to kind of balance out in the moment. Is this something that I could adjust in my schedule so I can make it work? If not, then I figure out how to let it be okay. definitely not perfect at it at all, but I think that has helped me to overcome that.
Yeah. So, what boundaries have you set up? Like, besides the obvious ones that you had to set up when you were a child, like, since you kind of became conscious of them?
Right. This question is kind of tough because I have set up so many boundaries for myself over the years with my, I'm going to put in air quotes, unique introduction to boundaries. I feel like I've been setting up boundaries for myself since I can literally remember, not only with other people, but also from a personal standpoint too. For example, when I was a kid, I was that kid who got money for their birthday and literally didn't spend any of it. It just went straight into my savings,
I
and
was too.
I would beat myself up mentally over the fact that like I spent any portion of that money. Like I had very, very strict boundaries with myself of what I could and could not do. Over the years it has lessened, but it's definitely been there. So, anyways, for me, I've set up boundaries with pretty much everyone and everything in my life. Now, am I always perfect with it? No, I'm a human. Some boundaries I struggle with more than others. But I think having to set boundaries at such a young age, it was never really difficult, as I talked about earlier in this episode, for me to be able to do it going forward in my life. I feel like I can kind of just set boundaries up like it's nobody's business. Whether that's good or not, I don't know.
I don't know. I think that there's good and bad to it, but no, not even. Like now that I say that, I don't think there's anything bad about that at all. Like, I mean, setting boundaries for yourself means putting yourself first, and I think other people might think it's bad because they don't have the same level of respect for themselves and putting themselves first. But as soon as somebody tells me, like, this is a boundary that I have and this is something that I need to keep myself balanced and healthy, then I really am like, all right, that's that. Like, I can't be mad because I want to do the same thing for myself. So do that.
And
Set all
I
boundaries.
think, right. And I hear what you're saying. And I think, like, to an extent, you are always allowed to have your emotion. But at the same time, you know, you have to respect what other people's boundaries are, and they're not responsible for your feelings on their boundaries. So I think feeling your emotion but not projecting it onto that person necessarily is a good thing and a healthy thing. But also having those feelings and feeling them are also equally as important. That's kind of a two-sided thing, but I hope that makes sense.
I mean, I think that actually brings us right into the next thing that we wanted to talk about, which is, like, I know that I've had a really hard time setting up boundaries for myself because it's really hard when other people don't respect them to actually, like, keep and maintain those boundaries. And that's, like, the hugest hurdle that I've really experienced. So do you think that you've had a hard time with that also and, like, keeping them because of that?
I think for me, this question has two answers. Number one, my largest challenge today when it comes to boundaries and what currently challenges me is boundaries with myself. I've become much more lax with them over the years because I think having such rigid boundaries in the past caused me anxiety, which I just talked about, you know, having a very set schedule and then getting anxious over those things not happening that I would beat myself up about. So by becoming more gentle with myself, in turn caused me to become a little bit more lax with boundaries, and sometimes it backfires on me.
Where, like, you don't keep it, you mean?
Yeah, like I'll set up a boundary for myself and I'll be like, I'm gonna wake up at 7:30 tomorrow morning, and then I'm gonna go grocery shopping, and then I'm gonna start my work day or something along those lines. And then I have my alarm go off in the morning at that set time, and I allow myself to sleep in because I'm tired and I know that sleep is also very important to me. So I think to myself, okay, when else can I fit this into my schedule? And then I think of another time and then I put it there and then I go back to sleep.
I don't think that's backfiring.
Just,
I think that's a good thing.
I think so too, but then sometimes I don't actually fall through with the second time that I plan it for. So
slippery slope.
Like sometimes, yeah, exactly. It's a very fine line there.
Yeah.
Number two is, this goes back to my childhood and dealing with my parent issue. I received a lot of backlash as a child with my actions to try and maintain boundaries with my parent. And it honestly was one of the most difficult and monumental items that has shaped me into who I am today as a person. None of my family, friends, teachers, etc., ever really felt like they took me seriously. I felt like they just always assumed I was over-exaggerating. And, I came from a decent family, had a very well-off childhood, at least from the outside, it looked that way. So anytime I would bring it up, my situation was always minimized or not listened to. Or if it was my family, I would be told that due to biological relation, I had to have a relationship with this person, my parent. And I was basically being over dramatic and spoiled and needed to learn to live with this parent. I was told that I needed to figure out how to make the relationship work in whatever way that meant. And whenever I would say anything back, such as, why do I have to be the grown-up and do the right thing in your eyes when my own parent can't even take me seriously or take this seriously and be a parent? To which I was basically scolded and told that this person is your parent and you will love them. Which, to this day, it's a hard pill for me to swallow.
Yeah.
Like, looking back on that now.
There's just no part of that that's okay. That's just not okay at all.
Right.
And it brings up the whole point of this podcast, not only for yourself realizing that the things you're going through are valid, because it sounds like you realized that wasn't okay, but realizing that other people's things that they're going through are valid. And the small things, whether it's setting a boundary of sleeping at a certain time or not hanging out with people at a certain time, versus what you were going through, it's all valid, and it should all be taken seriously by yourself and by the other people in your life.
Right. And so
how did you interact with people how did you live with those people?
Yeah, how did I interact with people who didn't respect my boundaries? Yeah. I don't really have a good answer, because I was physically forced to interact with these people on a daily basis. They were the people that provided me my life and my way of living, or at least the people who could help me get to where I needed to be. So I just learned to live with it. As sad and as, horrible as that sounds, I didn't have another choice. And eventually, as weeks passed into months, which passed into years, you kind of just eventually learn to live with your circumstance. You ignore the fact that it's happening until it becomes a problem again. Otherwise, you literally are going to live your life in a complete agony, and there's going to be no physical happy substance to your life. And
what did you do?
No person wants that.
How are you okay with that? I know you're saying you ignored it, but you just had you were miserable for 18 years and you had no.
So you basically, to answer your question, you learn to adapt. You learn to fight when you need to, and you learn when to just live and be a kid. And as horrible as an answer that probably sounds, sorry, I'm losing track of what I'm trying to say because this is just such a big topic. As horrible of an answer as that probably sounds, it's the truth. So that is literally the best answer I can give you, is you just learn to adapt, you learn when to fight, and you learn when not to fight, and you just live the best you can. And yeah, that's the best answer I have for you. Yeah. So, Sophia, how do you deal with people in your life who don't respect your boundaries?
Um,
Since I didn't really have much of a great answer besides just living life and to the best of your abilities.
yeah. Well, I think it is actually a good answer because it's coping mechanisms when you're in a situation you can't get out of. I mean, I think that the easiest answer is to get out of the situation where people don't respect your boundaries and remove those people from your life. And I think so. You were in a situation where you couldn't do that, and I actually was in a situation where I did that way too often. I would just be like, "Oh, these people aren't respecting my boundaries. Bye." Like I didn't know that. Like I said, I didn't have a word for that, but I would just be like, "I'm not friends with this person anymore. Bye." And just didn't tell them that I felt that way. I just was like internally like this isn't what I want, and then I would just remove myself without having a conversation with the person. So I think that both of those extremes are kind of I don't know if they're the best way to go about it, but that's how we went about it. I think if I were to like
Right.
give someone advice on how to deal with people who aren't respecting your boundaries from where I am now, I talk to them about it. I think that that's almost like duh, but I don't know if it is actually as common sense as it, because it clearly wasn't to me. I just was like telling people bye. But I think having a conversation with someone who's not respecting your boundaries and giving them the opportunity to respect that boundary, and then if they still don't, then having a more serious conversation, like this is something that I cannot be in this friendship if you don't respect. And then if they still don't, then remove that person from your life. But I think that there should be kind of like at least a 3 strikes you're out process with conversation about boundaries with people in your life who aren't respecting them before cutting them out.
Or 100 strikes and you're out, and your family still doesn't like
No,
that.
100
So
strikes is too many strikes. That's too many strikes.
That's my experience. But
um,
anyways, that
but like, has your relationship with those people changed now that you're older, or?
yes, and it's actually very funny that we're doing this episode right now because it literally just changed months ago. So, my sibling got married in August, and at this wedding, I got the chance to see my entire side of that unhealthy parent's family at the wedding for the first time in 10 years, I think, about that. So it was huge. It was huge, 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 huge event to go through. And at the wedding, sorry, this is like really hard for me to even talk about right now because it was just so recent and it was a huge thing. But at the wedding, one of my family members did something where my healthy parent actually saw it happen for the first time ever in my life, physically saw what happened after years of verbalizing the fact that this had been happening when I was younger, and they saw it happen to me as an adult. And in that moment, I was able, well, not in the moment, but like after the wedding happened, later that night actually, I sat down with my healthy parent and had a conversation. And I said, do you finally now see what I went through? Do you finally now get it? And they broke out crying and basically felt absolutely horrible. And we had a very truthful, honest conversation where, you know, they just basically said they were sorry to me and that it should have never happened, and, you know, hoped I could forgive them, and I did 100%. But yeah, like that's pretty much where I'm at now, and it just feels like this whole new lease on life because I finally feel validated in what I was feeling since I was a little kid.
I think that that's super huge that you said that, and that happened, and that we're able to share that on the podcast, because like the stuff that you went through is so heavy and so challenging. And I think that, like, if I was in your situation, it could have really made me develop some resentment towards the people who weren't listening to me. And I feel like maybe if someone out there is going through the same situation as you, where your family that you were trying to talk to wasn't listening to you, that maybe they are feeling resentment towards them. And so I think it's really valuable that you had that experience with the healthy parent, and that you're able to kind of like mend that relationship with that person, and that, like, don't give up on people, because, you know, maybe they will eventually realize it might take a lot, but it's really hard to, like, admit that the other parent in a situation like that is causing that much damage to your child. So yeah, that's crazy.
Right. Yeah. That definitely is crazy. So moving on to kind of a lighter note, have we even fully set up every boundary that we need?
No.
Yeah, I don't think that we have, and I don't think as human beings, maybe unless, like, I don't know, you're like 100 years old and have gone through like every single life circumstance possible, that you could have every boundary that you need set up, especially not where we are, being 23, 24 years old. So, and I think that's part of the whole reason that we even created this podcast, was because life changes and it goes through stages, and there's more areas for boundaries throughout life as we notice them, and we can adjust accordingly.
Yeah, I was thinking the exact same thing. Like, earlier you had mentioned that there's an evolution with what we need, and that changes the older we get and when our life experience is different. And so, yeah, I don't think I'm ever going to be done setting up boundaries, but
yeah, neither do I.
Yeah.
Now, you probably are all thinking, this sounds great, but where do I start with setting up boundaries? And some of you may be feeling overwhelmed in just the thought of the word boundaries. I know when I was younger and going through it, it definitely was a lot to digest. First, we want to acknowledge that setting boundaries can be really, really difficult. Boundaries are hard, and if it was easy, there wouldn't be countless self-help books, videos, courses, etc. focusing on boundaries and how to implement them into your life, especially living in a day-to-day society where the word no is often forced as far away from us as humanly possible. So, based off of our experiences, we came up with a couple of questions you could ask yourself in order to kind of start the process of making boundaries in your own life.
Yeah. And what you just said about the word no, that's just been a huge, huge thing in my boundary process and my journey. And so one of the first things that we suggest that you ask yourself, and that I ask myself on an everyday basis, is how are you feeling with the situation that you're in? Like, figure out what you're feeling, and if it's a situation that you need to set a boundary in. When do you feel uncomfortable? When do you feel drained? Do you have a person in your life that upsets you easily? Really think about how you're feeling in every situation that stresses you out, and in situations that make you feel happy, because that makes you set up the boundaries that you need in order to feel happy. Because you can't, like, if you don't know when you feel happy, you don't know what you need to actually set up for yourself. And, like, notice what your energy levels are like when you're around certain people or when you're in certain situations. Do you feel drained during them? Do you feel energized during them? Have you changed? Have you, like, noticed that throughout a friendship or a relationship with someone that you've changed because of it, or even with a job. Have you changed as a person because of this interaction? Has it been for the better? Has it been for the worse? And then another thing to think about in regards to a personal relationship with someone is positive and negative override, which like is a whole topic in and of itself, but you need to have kind of 5 positive experiences or feelings in a situation to override 1 negative one. So like think about the amount of times in a situation that you're feeling negative versus feeling positive, and that can really help you figure out where you need to start setting up those boundaries.
Most definitely, I completely agree with you. And I think that's number one. That's the number one way to start the process of setting up boundaries. Number 2 would be, what are your needs? And I think paying attention to how you interact with the world and the people around you will allow you to understand your needs more in depth. From a personal standpoint, I think that this question, when you ask yourself, is going to differ based on the different relationships that you have in your life. Your needs are different in every single, situation. Your needs from work, your needs from your friendships, your needs from romantic relationships, your needs from your parents, your needs from your children. It really all differs. But ask yourself, with that in mind, what are your needs in those specific situations?
Right. And then doing that first step, like noticing how you're feeling, it can answer those questions about like that second step is what are your needs, because I know a lot of people in my life who are like, I don't know what I need. So that's a really hard question to answer, but if you do that first step and notice how you're feeling, then that will help you realize what you need.
Yeah. And then once you have figured out what those needs are, ask yourself, are my needs being fulfilled within this situation or relationship? And that's pretty much a yes or no answer, but only you can answer that. And then the fourth one I think that is really big would be defining what is most important to you in your own life. And I kind of went into this a little bit, or I guess a lot of it, in our last episode about burnout. And for me, preventing burnout, one way that I did that was defining what was most important to me in my life and then, acting on that. But in this case, defining what is most important in your life will help you to set up boundaries. And
that'll help you prevent burnout.
Exactly. It'll help you to prevent burnout, but it'll help you to, leave behind the things that are not respecting your boundaries. I mean, if it's not as important to you, then it's a little bit easier to leave behind, at least in my own opinion.
Yeah. And then, so once you've kind of done all of that in your own head, then the next step is going to be practice. So you figured out what you're feeling, then you figured out what your needs are, and then you figured out whether or not these situations or people are meeting those needs. And that's all stuff that you're doing internally. Then you define what the most important things are. Then you got to practice it actually in your life. And an easy way to do that is kind of starting with smaller no's, communicating to people in your life that you're setting up boundaries. That's what I did. I started saying, I can't actually go out to dinner with you because I'm not feeling like that's something that will make me feel balanced right now. And doing it with people that may accept them more easily is going to be really helpful. Like I would probably tell Lauren, like, hey man, I'm going to practice this boundary on you. And then it'll get easier to do it with other people, I think, too. And it's going to feel really uncomfortable at first, but you got to practice it in your life. Like having it in your head is great, but if you don't actually practice doing it in little small ways by saying no to things or by saying yes to things, then it's not going to actually translate into setting up a boundary. And
I think too, just stressing the fact that, I think it'd be easier. You kind of already said it, but I just want to stress it. Doing it with somebody that you actually trust and would feel receptive to that information is going to be really key for you in practicing those small no's. But continue. Sorry for
No,
interjecting.
it's got to be reiterated. Like, if so, that's fine. And then, like I said, it's going to be kind of uncomfortable at first, and people may not, like in Lauren's experience and in my experience, people may not be receptive to that boundary. They may say, why do you have to do that for yourself? Or like, you have this time, why aren't you filling it with this thing? Like, you have to remind yourself it's okay to say no. It's okay to feel this way. It's okay to not be able to do that thing. That's my boundary. So practice it. And then if you come up with challenges, that internal dialogue and reminding yourself that it's okay to say no, it's okay to prioritize yourself. That's the whole point of this podcast. What you're feeling is real and valid. Constantly remind yourself it's okay, even when other people are not respecting that. And then you kind of go into that situation. If people are constantly not respecting that, are those people that you want to continue having in your life? That's another question you want to ask later on. But I think in order to start setting up boundaries, those would be like the 6 steps to do that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I hope that everybody was able to gain something through that, and I hope that that was helpful.
Yeah. So I think that kind of ties up the episode. So
yeah. Well, we hope that you all have a great rest of your week, and feel free to send us over some messages on our email and social media. We finally got it all linked up, so we would love to hear feedback if anybody has any. And
yeah, see you in 2 weeks.
Yep. All right, bye.